Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second installment of Lunchbox Lessons from Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site, where we offer an afternoon program for your enjoyment during all of the wonderful fun that is the spring and summer of 2021. And today we have Kelly Yacobucci Farquhar, who is the Montgomery County Historian and Records Management Officer. Their offices are in the old courthouse in the Montgomery County Department of History and Archives in Fonda, New York, which was established in 1934. In 2004, she published Images of America book on Montgomery County, and in 2006, Kelly was also the co-author of a similar book on Amsterdam, New York. She has also had published works on the Underground Railroad in Montgomery County. The Department of History and Archives has an incredible collection, and many people from all over the US and Canada seek out their genealogical treasures as they trace their own ancestry to this region of New York State. As the county historian, Kelly provides valuable services helping to research and preserve the amazing and richly diverse history of this area in the Mohawk Valley. As a records management officer, she maintains the physical and intellectual control of the inactive records and historical records created by county departments. Using her wide experience, she has also helped municipalities within the county write grants and respond to disasters. She has collaborated with schools and historic sites to create outreach kits designed as tools for teaching local history in the county's school districts and beyond. Thank you very much for joining us, and please welcome Kelly Farquhar. And something's happened now, and Kelly, you're somehow muted, and I can't get you to unmute.
How about now?
Yeah, very good. All right. Thank you. I'm going to
Okay.
this out now.
Okay, so thank you for welcoming me to the Lunchbox series. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Civil War and Civil War nurses, and one Civil War nurse in particular who was a local woman. Her name was Maria Schram. So I've always been interested in Civil War history, and I remember as far back as when I was, a little girl, I remember watching John Jake's North and South on television, and I was fascinated and saddened at the same time watching the families that were just torn apart because of which side of the spectrum they were on, whether they were on the northern side or the Confederate side. And actually the war between the states affected families all across the nation, Union and Confederate alike. And in spite of all the romantic lore that surrounds Civil War history, I was horrified by, the brutality of the battles, and there really is nothing romantic about the reality of war. So over the years, I've studied Civil War history, and I studied in classes in college. And as county historian, I've researched local men who served their country in battle. Young men left their mothers and fathers and their wives and their children to go off to war. So I've even learned about some of the women who concealed their identities and enlisted as male soldiers to fight on both sides. But in all of the studying that I did, very rarely did I ever come across any information on the women who cared for the wounded and the dying soldiers. In 1861, the lives of a young couple residing in Amsterdam, Daniel and Maria Schram, were interrupted by the outbreak of war. Many Northerners and Southerners alike believed that there actually would be a quick end to the strife that was going on at the time. And someone once said, quote, "How confident we were that when the blue met the gray, the conflict would result in a grand victory for the Union Army. Everybody confident that the end of the war would come with the beginning," end quote. However, as the early battles in 1861 waged on, it soon became evident that each side was going to be in it for the long haul. So this is a nice view of Amsterdam in the 19th century, and it's taken from the south side of the Mohawk River. Born the 21st of March, 1834 in the town of Ephrata to Solomon and Sarah Scoten Bullock, Anne Maria was the eldest child and the only surviving daughter. And most likely she became a very skilled caregiver with 4 younger brothers. Solomon Bullock, who was a boatman, died in 1850, leaving Sarah, who was also known as Sally, to raise their 5 children alone. Around 1856, their daughter Anne Maria married another Ephrata native, Daniel Schram. The following year, the couple welcomed their first child, a son, Byron. The young Schram family removed to Amsterdam, where they were living by 1860. Less than 6 months after the outbreak of war, Daniel Schram, who was a stonemason, enlisted in Company B of the 32nd New York Volunteers. 2 years later, Anne Maria's younger brother, James C. Bullock, who at that time was a resident of the town of Minden, enlisted with the 153rd New York Volunteers. Eager to do her part in contributing to the war effort, or perhaps to be closer to her husband, as was the case with many women, Anne Maria left her young son with family and traveled south to nurse wounded soldiers back to health. Although there are reports of wives who packed up their children to travel with their husbands' regiments, doing cooking and cleaning within the army camps, this wasn't a typical response for a young mother during this time period. Usually the wives remained at home to care for the children and the homestead or the farm. A local newspaper at that time reported that Mrs. Schram received assistance from various patriotic citizens, allowing her the opportunity to proceed to the front and carry out her noble purpose of rendering aid as a volunteer nurse in Army hospitals. Whether that assistance came in the form of financial contributions or caring for her young son, or even pulling political strings, we don't really know. We do know, however, that she cared for the wounded and dying soldiers brought to the Frederick Hospital just off the fields of South Mountain and Antietam. Very possibly, Mrs. Schram could have helped to care for her own husband, Daniel.
Hey, Kelly?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. You went to advance a slide, and we're not seeing that. We're still on the first one here.
Okay, let's see. Can you see the image of the 32nd New York?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Okay, so after President Lincoln's call for approximately 75,000 troops following the fall of Fort Sumter, the 32nd Regiment under Colonel Roderick Matheson and Lieutenant Colonel Francis Pinto mustered into service for 2 years on May 31st, 1861. From a village of less than 5,000 residents, about 100 Amsterdamians quickly enlisted to form a company in Harmony Hall over the Farmers National Bank on Main Street. Companies B and D were recruited out of Amsterdam, while others came from Ithaca, Johnstown, Tarrytown, and New York City. Early on in their service, the 32nd served at Washington, D.C. and Alexandria, Virginia. The regiment first saw action at Fairfax Courthouse, and then a few days later at the First Battle of Bull Run. They also participated in the Peninsular Campaign, South Mountain, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. During its service and over the course of 16 battles, the 32nd Regiment lost a total of 9 officers and 99 enlisted men, all from having been killed in battle from their battle wounds and or disease. So this photograph that's on the screen was taken at Matthew Brady's studios in New York City, and it shows the officers of the 32nd Regiment. We have this photograph in our collection at the Department of History and Archives. And in the very center of the photograph is Francis Pinto. So can you see that I've advanced on to the next screen?
Yep.
Okay. So the onset of the Civil War prompted action for dealing with the victims, the wounded and dying soldiers. So the US Sanitary Commission was created by federal legislation, and it was signed by President Abraham Lincoln on June 18, 1861, as a private volunteer relief agency to support the sick and wounded soldiers of the United States Army. The commission was modeled after the British Commission that was organized during the Crimean War. Henry W. Bellows, a Massachusetts minister, became president of the commission, and Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who designed Central Park in New York, served as its executive secretary. At the time of the Sanitary Commission's creation, there were no great numbers of casualties from the war at that point. All that changed a month later with the clash at Bull Run, the first major battle of the war. The confrontation between McDowell's Union forces and the Confederate troops led by Johnston and Beauregard at Manassas Junction, just miles outside of Washington, D.C., resulted in almost 5,000 combined casualties. Now, the need for places and people to care for the casualties was urgent. Prior to the war, education for nursing as a profession was very lacking in the United States. Because societal attitudes believed that women were not physically robust enough to deal with caring for the sick and injured, nursing duties were typically filled by men. That is, until a shortage of men were there to fill the positions. Dorothea Dix, on the left-hand side of the screen, received an appointment by the United States government as superintendent of the female nurses for the Sanitary Commission. Dix argued with Army doctors about bringing women into the hospitals to serve as nurses. There was that certain prejudice that women were not capable of serving in that capacity. However, Dix convinced them of the value that women brought to the hospitals. She soon after sent out a circular calling for women to volunteer as nurses. There were very strict guidelines imposed upon the volunteer nurses at the onset of the Civil War. In the circular, Dix was looking for women who were matronly, neat, and orderly, and practiced sobriety. She advised, quote, all applicants must present certification of qualifications and good character from at least 2 persons of trust, testifying to their morality, integrity, seriousness, and capacity for care of the sick, end quote. Dix also restricted applicants to those over the age of 30, and quote, they had to be devoid of personal attractions, end quote. Essentially meaning they could not wear any jewelry or makeup, and they had to dress very plainly. Nurses were prohibited from socializing with either the surgeons or the patients in order to protect them from being exploited. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see an image of Clara Barton. Can you see that I advanced the screen, David?
Yep.
Okay, good. So nursing duties included cleaning the soldiers' wounds, administering treatments, preparing and serving meals, and distributing clothing and supplies from the US Christian and Sanitary Commissions. Rarely did the nurses have a break. Typically, they worked more than 14 hours at a time. The physical labor was exhausting. The conditions were horrific, and they had very limited supplies and not enough staff to accommodate the increasing numbers of wounded and dying soldiers. Maggie McLean, who writes in her Civil War Women blog, she wrote about a woman named Euphemia Goldsboro. She said that, quote, women who chose to become nurses were judged harshly by society, and they exposed themselves to disease, injury from battle, and sexual harassment. At that time, all medical positions, including nurses, were considered male occupations, but with so many injured and dying soldiers in makeshift hospitals greatly in need of care, societal objections to female nurses were soon overcome. So on the slide, I have this quote from Georgiana Woolsey Bacon, and she writes that, quote, No one knows who did not watch the thing from the beginning, how much opposition, how much ill will, how much unfeeling want of thought these women nurses endured. Hardly a surgeon whom I can think of received or treated them with even common courtesy. Government had decided that women should be employed, and the army surgeons, unable therefore to close the hospital against them, determined to make their lives so unbearable that they should be forced in self-defense to leave. So female nurses typically worked in base hospitals, but in rare cases they worked in field hospitals near the front lines. Any building could become a makeshift hospital. Before the war, there was no military hospital, no trained staff, and no humane means of transporting wounded and sick soldiers. Mary Livermore indicated that, quote, our entire military and medical systems, which seemed well nigh perfect at last, were created in the very midst of the war, end quote. Being near or at the hospitals on the front lines, the nurses did face very real dangers. Not only were they exposed to illness, but due to unsanitary conditions while caring for the sick soldiers, the artillery and gunfire were imminent. Clara Barton, who is perhaps the most famous nurse, and she's credited with founding the American Red Cross, reportedly, quote, was working tirelessly as a nurse and aid worker during the Battle of Antietam when a bullet pierced the sleeve of her dress and killed the man she was caring for. In another book by Bonnie Tsui, the book is called She Went to the Field, Women Soldiers of the Civil War. She describes how nurses such as Cornelia Hancock canvassed local homes for blankets and other supplies to care for Gettysburg's wounded because they had a lack of sheets and clothing or tents to shelter them. So again, Clara Barton, while she was on the front lines at Antietam, she treated the wounded by reportedly removing bullets with her own pocket knife and using corn husks to cover the wounds when she ran out of bandages. So all the while women were treating the wounded, the compensation that they received, some who received compensation, was actually regulated by an act of Congress, and that compensation amounted to about 40 cents per day, and they may have one meal a day that was allowed for them. But many nurses actually received no compensation at all. And in spite of the conditions, many who volunteered as nurses because they had husbands or sons on the front lines, they were actually also providing physical, emotional, and spiritual care for their patients and the families who were able to visit them. So the image on the screen next to the quote is actually a scene from Mercy Street, which was a PBS series for about 2 seasons. And it followed 2 nurses, one on the Confederate side and on the northern side, and the doctors, and they were at the Mansion House Hospital in Alexandria, Virginia. And some of the characters were actually based on real people. Unfortunately, the season ended, or the series ended, I think, after the 2nd season, but you might be able to catch it on either Netflix or Amazon Prime now. Okay, so I just advanced to the next screen. And
Looks
this,
good.
I'm sorry?
Looks good.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, keep telling me if you don't see the next advanced screen. But so in this slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the battles, the Antietam and South Mountain. So during the Battle of South Mountain, Robert E. Lee was moving with his Army of Northern Virginia, and he invaded Maryland on September 4th, 1862, first occupying Frederick, Maryland, and then moving toward Hagerstown. George McClellan, who was the general for the Army of the Potomac, he pursued Lee, leaving forces at Washington to defend the capital. McClellan obtained a copy of Lee's battle plans in which he divided his army, sending some to capture Harper's Ferry and some regiments to remain around the South Mountain gaps. McClellan capitalized on that division and attacked Lee's army in 2 waves. Lee was forced to abandon his move north and instead defend his forces, and this was known as the Battle of South Mountain on September 14th, 1862. So reinforcements for Lee gathered, and 3 days later resulted in the battle at Antietam. Antietam was known as the bloodiest one-day battle in American history, where 23,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing after 12 hours of savage combat on September 17, 1862. According to the National Park Service's website, the Battle of Antietam ended the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia's first invasion into the North and led to Abraham Lincoln's issuance of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So on the National Park Service website, you can see here is an image of the New York State Monument at Antietam Battlefield. They talk about the Excelsior Monument, Antietam, and it commemorates the services of New York's officers and soldiers during that battle. There were 67 regiments of infantry, 5 regiments of cavalry, 14 artillery batteries, and 2 regiments of engineers. The monument reads that, quote, New York's losses on this field were 65 officers and 624 enlisted men killed or mortally wounded, 110 officers and 2,687 enlisted men wounded, and 2 officers and 277 men captured or missing, making a total of 3,765, end quote. It was at Antietam where Daniel Schram's tenure as a soldier came to an end due to his wounds that he received in his right arm. Records from the National Civil War Museum database show that Daniel was admitted to one of the hospitals around Frederick, Maryland, with a gunshot wound, and he was identified as patient number 477. Daniel was discharged from the hospital in October of 1862 and received an honorable discharge from the Army on December 31st of that year. The US Sanitary Commission subsidized their efforts through donations and what they called sanitary fairs. So Mary Livermore recounted how the Sanitary Commission, after the Battle of Antietam, distributed 28,763 pieces of dry goods, shirts, towels, bed ticks, and pillows, 30 barrels of old linen, bandages, and lint, 3,188 pounds of farina, over 2,600 pounds of condensed milk, 5,000 pounds of beef stock and canned meats, 3,000 bottles of wine and cordials, 4,000 sets of hospital clothing, several tons of lemon and other fruits, crackers, tea, sugar, tin cups, chloroform, opiates, surgical equipments, other hospital conveniences were all distributed at that time. More than 3 decades after the close of the war, Mary Gardner Holland compiled sketches of some of the women who administered care to the wounded and sick soldiers in a book that she called Our Army Nurses, Interesting Sketches and Photographs of Over 100 of the Noble Women Who Served in Hospitals and on the Battlefields During Our Late Civil War, 1861 to 1865. So on the right, you'll see a picture of Anne Maria Schram from that book. And at the time, in 1891, she was writing from her home in Fort Plain, and she cited an article that appeared in the newspaper. It was the March 3rd, 1891 issue of the Gloversville Leader. And Anne Maria Schram says that she set out from her home in Amsterdam at that time to render aid as a volunteer nurse to Burkittsville, Maryland, only to find that the field hospital had moved 16 miles west to Frederick, Maryland. Mrs. Schram was assigned by medical staff to duty as a hospital nurse at Camp B outside Frederick City, where she served under Dr. Charles F. Haynes of Brighton, Massachusetts. So here, which possibly at the farm owned by Philip Pry, which you see the house on the left-hand side of the screen, she could have nursed the sick and wounded from the battles at both Antietam and South Mountain in the Pry barn. The article also indicated that Mrs. Schram received no compensation for her nursing duties and that she paid for her own boarding expenses, as well as purchased certain necessities for her patients that weren't provided by the Army. However, after 8 months of serving as a nurse and due to failing health, Anne Maria Schram returned home to her family. The return to civilian life was not always an easy one for the Schrams. In 1865, the family still lived in Amsterdam, but Daniel had difficulty finding local masonry jobs and therefore often lived away from his family in search of work. By 1867, they had a daughter named Camilla. By 1870, the Schrams were living in Fort Plain with Anne Maria's mother, Sarah Bullock, while Daniel's employment at that time took him to Syracuse and Middleville in Herkimer County, where he worked on the construction of the Universalist Church. Perhaps it was unsteady work or residual ill health from his war service that led to an unfortunate event in 1884 when Anne Maria's husband was shot. Daniel reportedly feared a group of Italians and held them responsible for his shootings, but authorities believed it was actually Daniel who attempted to end his own life with a revolver that he had purchased a month prior. Luckily, he recovered from his wounds, and later on in life, he suffered from cataracts and, despite surgery to improve his condition, had one eye removed with sight loss in the remaining eye. Their son, Byron, married a Canajoharie woman in 1879, and that marriage produced a son. Byron, for a time, resided at the Westchester County poorhouse as a vagrant and alcoholic, and his date and location of death is uncertain, but he may have died in Ontario in 1894. I have not been able to definitively document that. The daughter Camilla, she married Willard Finehout, and she died from appendicitis at the young age of 36, leaving a child motherless. In spite of the challenges that Anne Maria Schram faced, her strong resolve compelled her to move forward. The Schrams owned and lived in a 2-family home on Main Street in Fort Plain until they sold it in 1907. Both Anne Maria and her husband Daniel were instrumental in organizing, along with other area Civil War veterans, the clock post of the Grand Army of the Republic and the local chapter of the Women's Relief Corps, in which Anne Maria served as president. They traveled extensively from Washington, D.C. to Niagara Falls and all over, attending GAR encampments and nurses' conventions from the later 1880s into the early 1900s, where Anne Maria was, quote, one of the best-known members of the association. She was then elected as national chaplain of the Army Nurses Association in 1902. In December 1890, Congressman Stephen Sanford of Amsterdam introduced a bill in Congress to grant a pension of $12 a month to a couple of women, local women, including Anne Maria Schram, for her services as a volunteer hospital nurse during the war. It went through the Committee on Invalid Pensions and passed in the House of Representatives on January 16th, and then went to the Senate, where it remained in the Invalid Pensions Committee for 10 days. The bill passed the Senate on January 31st, 1891. An article in the local paper claimed that, quote, neither of these claimants was provided for under any general pension law, but the justice of their claims appealed to Mr. Sanford, and he has not had an easy task to advocate their cause at each step through the devious ways of legislation to final success, end quote. A year later, however, On August 5th, 1892, President Benjamin Harrison signed into law the Army Nurses Pension Act, allowing all women who served the Union Army as nurses could be granted a pension of $12 a month. However, the caveat was that they had to have served at least 6 months, and they had to be hired by someone who was authorized by the War Department to engage the nurses. So currently, the National Archives in Washington has almost 2,500 pension applications on file for women who served as Civil War nurses. Daniel Schram did receive a pension for his service as well. By 1910, his allowance increased from $24 to $30 per month, citing that he was helpless due to loss of eyesight. At the age of 67, Maria Schram died on July 31st, 1911 at her home in Albany. Her remains were brought back to Fort Plain, where her funeral was held at the Catherine Nellis Memorial Chapel in the Fort Plain Cemetery. After Anne Maria's death, Daniel Schram went to live at the Soldiers' Home in Bath, Steuben County, and there he died on February 12, 1915 at the age of 83 years old. A stone marks the Schram's graves in the Fort Plain Cemetery. Unfortunately, no further record of Anne Maria's contributions with either the Clock Post GAR or the Women's Relief Corps remains. The rooms of the Clock Post were on the second and third floors of the building occupied by the Hotel Greeley, which was destroyed by fire. And that was in the village of Fort Plain. So over the course of the war, over 15,000 women volunteered as nurses. They came from all walks of life, rich and poor, white and black, assisting in surgical procedures, dressing wounds, giving medications, supervising supplies, cooking special foods for limited diets, cleaning bedding and clothing, writing letters to families, and just providing general comfort. Alice P. Stein appreciated the road paved by Civil War nurses in her 1999 article when she said that with no formal training, they, quote, labored tirelessly to bring aid and comfort to the sick and wounded soldiers on both sides of the fighting. The nurses of the Civil War left a heritage far beyond a country's gratitude for bodies salvaged and spirits renewed. Observing the difference they had made, both the public and the medical community finally came to recognize nursing as a legitimate profession, end quote. So the Women's Relief Corps badge, which you'll see on the right side of the screen, is a Maltese cross attached to a bar pin with a red, white, and blue ribbon. The center holds the American flag and is encircled in a wreath of stars depicting 5 outstanding figures. There's the Goddess of Liberty, a soldier, a boy, a woman, and a child. The soldier symbolizes fraternity because the comrades created their organization as their auxiliary in 1883. The boy is emblematic of the youth and strength of the future life of the nation. The woman is emblematic of motherhood, the very source of all civilization throughout the world. She has taught mercy, kindness, and has extended charity from the beginning of time. The child is emblematic of the hope of the world, with our patriotic teachings of loyalty to the nation's laws and principles, with freedom and justice for future generations yet unborn. The bar pin holding the red, white, and blue ribbon is engraved with the initials FCL as a reminder of their motto, fraternity, charity, and loyalty. And that concludes the presentation.
Thank you very much, Kelly. This is the part where I wish I had some sort of audio file where I could insert clapping, because that's what you kind of miss.
Oh.
That immediate response, or while you're giving an online program, you miss out on the the space within the room and that kind of reaction.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
I'll have to come up with some sort of a sound effect or something like that I can insert. So, but thank you very much for this program, and I'll put it out there for those that are on. You can use that chat function if you have any questions. You can pose those in there. So I was just gonna. You'd mentioned that there was like 2,500 applications in the National Archives. Do you know if those applications being stored in the archives are because they were approved, or is that just the number of just applications? We don't really know how many of these nurses actually received a pension.
Yeah, I don't know, unfortunately, how many actually received the pension. But I believe that's just the number of applicants. I've tried to get Maria Schram's pension application, and I have faced some difficulty. As you saw on the screen, there was a card which was actually on file for her with an identification number for the pension application, but actually tracking that pension application down has been very difficult. They've shown there was like it was filed under a different name, and I have not had any luck getting a copy of that, because I would love to see the application and maybe get some more insight into her daily life, as a nurse.
That's a good point, and it's all the more reason why records management officers and records management policies are extremely important. So hopefully in the future that there aren't other people that will be looking for things that disappeared into the wrong file. But yeah. I like that you hopefully that'll come to light and that there'll be some information on there. For those that might not be aware, a lot of those pension applications have to have a certain level of detail in order to be approved. And so her outlining, what she was doing and potentially some really in-depth stories on that would really open this presentation to a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
And I do like that you kind of started off particularly with the how women who actually would seek out to be nurses or seek out anything in the medical profession were kind of looked upon. And now it kind of seems like gladly a lot more of doctors that are nurses or nurses that are women and doctors that are women. It becomes more common practice now, and it's obviously much more accepted, but almost even to the other direction where nursing seems kind of in a popular belief of being much more of a woman's job anyway. So it's almost like there's a stigma attached to a male who wants to be a nurse at this point.
Yeah. For some reason, American society, they thought that it was really disgraceful for a woman to care for strangers. Women often were caring for their family or their neighbors, but to be put in a position where they were, caring and providing that level of comfort for people that they didn't even know, it was considered disgraceful. And they, there was this, like you said, the stigma that it called into question, women who were performing those duties. It's very interesting to see the transition of how society viewed nurses before, during, and then after the war. And they really needed them to perform those duties because they didn't have anybody else. Just like with World War II, when women were going into the factories and performing jobs that were typically male related. Men were on the front line, so women needed to fill these positions.
That's a great point, and that it seems like that's kind of that reoccurring thing, particularly in American history, where women will step in and fill those roles as men go off and fight early on, and that almost immediately afterwards, they're yet again pushed aside into a domestic role, at least leading up until much later. I good point with the World War II, and I think that, in studying these events where women are really kind of stepping up into these roles and then being forced out, that seems to be the lesson learned after World War II was we're not going to go so quietly, and it really kind of opens up a new level of the equality being sought in America. So, and that's by telling stories like this and sharing the history of women and events in our nation's history and our local history are so important. So I'm so grateful that you had this presentation and you were willing to do it for our Lunchbox lesson today. And I do not see any questions come in on the chat. So I think that you covered a lot of great details and a lot of interesting bits about the Schram family and just a lot of, I'm kind of at a loss for words here because there's no other questions that I would have because you were quite detailed and it was really exciting. And I think I've been a party to a presentation that you gave similar to this that I also found super engaging and enjoyable. And it's met all of my expectations and more. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties that we had. But I hope everybody, enjoyed learning a little bit about the Schrams and the Civil War nurses. And, hopefully I will one day find out some more information and maybe add to this presentation.
That would be great. And then we'll do it again with the bigger, better remix version.
Right, a reboot.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Kelly Farquhar, the Montgomery County Historian and Records Management Officer. This has been great. And we'll talk again soon. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
All right. Thank you. Everybody have a great day.